Hey everybody, Aaron here. TBR, to be released. So today I wanted to talk to you guys about braking, and specifically braking with your feet. There's a lot of different techniques that come into play to basically accomplish like proper braking, but the way you use your feet is going to make a huge difference in basically the effectiveness and safety of your braking. I think everybody can relate as a beginner mountain biker. When you're starting out, I'd say braking is probably one of the most intimidating parts of riding. As the trail gets steeper, you feel like you can't slow down. You feel like no matter what you do, you're skidding. A lot of times you drop a foot down, which makes it even worse. And you kind of just feel like a runaway train. So today I'm gonna explain basically, specifically how your feet come into play. And so this will allow you to basically brake harder and safer, more effectively, all that kind of stuff. So we'll start in kind of a controlled environment, and then I'll kind of show you like a staged approach on how you can practice this in different areas, basically from a flat, smooth dirt road like this, all the way to kind of a really steep, kind of gnarly section of trail. So let's get right into it. Okay, so when braking with your feet, there's basically in my opinion, two things that are the most important factors to consider. Number one would be level pedals. This is by far one of the most common mistakes I see when it comes to beginner mountain bikers, is they have a tendency, especially when you start to get a bit nervous or it starts to get too steep and you feel like you can't stop, the common natural reaction is to drop one foot down. It's basically the worst thing you can do because you're imbalancing the bike. You're gonna make it want to pull to basically the direction where you're dropping a foot. You're also, if you're riding over anything rough, rocks or anything like that, as you drop that foot down, you've now taken out probably half of the ground clearance from the ground to your pedal. So one of the most common ways to have a huge crash when doing that is when you drop that pedal down, you'll catch it on a rock and then you'll end up having a big crash. So number one, most important thing by far when it comes to using your feet when braking properly is to always maintain level pedals. So that is to say, both pedals are basically in line with each other. So you're not dropping one down like this, either this way or this way. So always keeping those pedals perfectly level is basically always a starting point. There's never a situation when you're braking in a flat line where that is not going to be the technique. So that's something you're gonna have to get comfortable and be confident that that is the best way to brake. We'll explain that a little bit further. So that's number one. Number two is using your heels when you brake. Basically there's three main levers, in your lower body when it comes to being able to use your body to kind of get low and get the bike to stick to the ground. First hinge point is at your hip, second is at your knee, and third is at your ankle. So today we are going to basically explain how important it is to use your ankle and dropping your heels when you brake. So big thing you see with a lot of people when they're starting to brake is that a lot of times you're starting on flat pedals, which I would recommend. This is the easiest way to develop a good technique, but it will also make you pay faster if you do not have good technique. So proper braking position with your ankles. It is important to be able to allow this ankle to drop down when you're braking. As I said, this is a hinge point. So not only as you drop your heels, put the weight further down into the bike, which will give you better traction. As the terrain gets steeper as well, it will allow your body to move back to kind of match that angle, so you don't feel like you're getting balled up over the front of the bike. And two, as the terrain is rough and moving, if you've got an ankle position like this, your foot is gonna start to bounce off the front of the pedal. You're also going to be taking out basically a natural suspension point in the body, which is this ankle and how it moves. So as you drop your ankle, it puts more pressure down into the bike lower, you get better traction, you're allowed to move your hips back, get in a better braking position as it gets steeper, and you're also going to allow yourself to have a little bit of a suspension here as you roll over rocks to kind of lessen kind of how harsh that is than if you just were to lock your feet out here. So those are the two main points. I'm going to explain it a little bit further, and then we're kind of going to get into a demonstration of kind of like where you can practice this and kind of how to progress it. I'm a big believer in starting as basic as possible and learning this in a way that's very safe and very repeatable, so you can do it a lot of times safely to where it kind of becomes second nature to as you take it to maybe say a steeper dirt road like we'll do next, or then ultimately to the trail. It's already kind of becoming natural, and it's not something you have to think about in a in an atmosphere where there's like consequences if you mess it up. So I would recommend basically starting on a flat dirt road like this or a parking lot, and basically just pedal up to speed, nothing crazy. And as you get on the brakes and your weight shifts back, practice just always having level pedals, starters, and then number 2, allowing as your weight shifts back to allow your heels to drop at the same time. And notice basically if you are to keep your feet completely flat and you get on the brakes, what does that feel like? Like how does it shift your body weight forward, and also like the extra strain it puts on your legs when you're not diving your feet, because you're basically having to hold your feet in spot so they don't slide off the front. You gotta flex your calves a little bit more, whereas if you drop your heels and you lean back, you're kind of naturally pushing into the angle, so it's kind of using the bigger muscles of your body. It's a little less fatiguing, and ultimately you'll notice you're getting a lot better grip onto the ground. So basically we'll start here, and then you can kind of practice from there, and then we'll move on from here. Here we are, step 2. So after you've kind of dialed in these techniques and you've got the level pedals, feeling comfortable, you're kind of used to like letting your heels drop a little bit under braking, kind of getting that timing down, then my next recommendation would basically be to do the same thing, but find like a dirt road or something that's a little bit steeper. Again, pretty safe. I'd recommend a flat surface. This is kind of not totally ideal. There's some rain ruts, but there's a little spot here that's nice and flat. So you will start to notice a lot more how this benefits you as you start to add pitch to the trail or to the road. You will notice if you don't dive your feet, you will have a tendency to start getting pushed up forward over the front of the bike instead of being able to keep your weight back, and keep that weight down low too, so that the tires are kind of digging into the ground more evenly. If this was really rough and bumpy and you were to come in here pretty fast and then get on the brakes without diving your feet, you're gonna start noticing that your feet are gonna start chattering off the front of the pedals. Whereas if you can dive your ankles a little bit, they're basically pushing into the right part of the pedal instead of you hitting bumps and them starting to float forwards. One thing when I say to dive your ankles, you are still, it's not dead weight, if that makes sense. So you're dropping your ankles basically about as far as you can get them, especially as it gets steeper, but you're not just like letting them drop to where they're just hanging and they're not supported at all. I can imagine if that was to happen, you might get some injuries and whatever. So it's like you're kind of purposely letting your ankles drop. You're not just like if you're gonna do a calf raise like on the side of a curb, you're not just like letting that thing flop down with like no support. So it is still a little bit supported, but you are kind of diving them down. So yeah, we'll kind of run through a couple of demonstrations here doing the same thing, and then we'll move on to the trail. Basically just gonna take a couple of pedals here, get a little bit of speed, nothing crazy. You don't need to be like skidding and really going nuts on this. It's more about like starting nice and slow. Something that you can really pay attention to what you're doing. So again, level pedals first and foremost, and then second, allowing those heels to dive as you get on the brakes, so you can feel as your weight shifts back, the heels come down and everything kind of stays nice and even there. So you just take a couple of pedals and then control, learn on how to do this basically nice and controlled. Yeah, she's trying to avoid. So there you go. I try to demonstrate it correctly and incorrectly. It's pretty awkward for me to try to do it incorrect, so it might look a little goofy. But honestly, that's where I find a lot of people start out. So once you've gotten comfortable here, then we'll basically move on to a trail. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is the amount that you dive your heels is not always the same. You always want those things to be down a little bit, because it's gonna keep that angle of your foot on your pedal a lot better and allow it not to be chattering off all the time. But basically, the harder you brake, the more you dive your heels, and the easier you brake, the less you need to dive your heels. So something else to keep in mind. So now that we've done this on kind of controlled surfaces, once this is comfortable, you kind of got the vibe, then we'll go take this to a steep section of trail. Okay, so here we are, last section of the 3-step progression. I wanted to kind of show you sort of the extreme ends of both sides. So one would be a flat paved parking lot, and then you basically go to the most advanced type of a section would be something like this. So the pitch on this section is basically very steep. It's really rough as well. And so basically, if you don't do everything we've talked about, you're not gonna make it through this section, probably even without a crash. So first thing first, level pedals, always level pedals. That has to be the starting point. You are always, especially when you're learning, the natural reaction is always to drop a pedal when you start to get scared and you feel like it's getting steep and you can't slow down. Trust me, that is just never going to work out. It's never the right technique. And you will clip a pedal on a rock and crash, or at the very least not be able to get the weight into the wheels like you need to. So really being focused and disciplined on making yourself maintain level pedals is always a starting point. Once you are there, then allowing your feet to dive or your heels to dive in. That is going to lower your body on the bike, get your weight a little bit further back as the terrain gets steeper, so you're not feeling like you're getting pushed forward over the handlebars. You're gonna be able to get more weight into the wheels and ultimately better traction on the ground. Allowing your ankles to hinge as well is going to act as sort of a point of suspension. So in a section like this, where you start to get a bunch of braking bumps and sort of rough terrain, it's gonna allow your knees, hips, and ankles all to kind of work as a suspension part with the bike, so nothing's rigid, so nothing's gonna start bouncing off of the pedals. So in this section, you're basically rolling from the top. It's straight down, very steep, very rough. So again, it's gonna be weight back, level pedals, diving your heels. You come off this little rock drop, and then you've got a really hard braking zone through here that's pretty braking bumps up here at the top. You got a little bit of a rut here. And then you basically need to slow all of this speed down to almost a stop before you drop into this last steep section of trail right here. So you've got this really hard braking zone here where you really need the bike to slow down almost completely, because then you're gonna roll down the steep rock, and then you got a really sharp turn at the bottom. So if you come into this with too much speed and catch air off of this, you're just gonna basically hit the berm like a jump and you're gonna be in all kinds of trouble. So this section really needs traction. You need to get the bike to settle to the ground through these bumps and basically scrub all of this speed off before you get here. And this is still pretty steep. So the only way you're gonna accomplish that is basically by using your feet in all the ways we've talked about. If I get to here and I panic and I drop a foot down, I'm gonna catch it on this first rock and I'm gonna have a huge endo into the turn. So obviously, no go. Then for a lot of people that are beginners, when you roll up to something like this and you see it get really steep, your first sort of natural reaction is gonna be to drop a foot to try to save yourself. That's basically the worst thing you could possibly do. So level pedals, and then trying to get the bike to really, and the tires really dig into the ground, so it's really diving those heels. This is a section that is very steep. You really need to brake really hard, so you're gonna really dive those heels in a lot to try to help get that done. So I'm not gonna try to probably demonstrate the wrong way to do it here because I don't wanna have a big crash. So we're basically just gonna ride through this section a few times, get a couple of angles, and hopefully you guys can kind of see the body positioning and the ankle positioning and all that stuff on how we get the bike to grip to the ground. So let's get into it. All right, so here's one of those sections where having level pedals is gonna be super important. As I said, the rockier and rougher it gets, if you do not have level pedals, you're gonna catch a pedal and you're gonna pay the price, and it's gonna be a big one. As you come in here, this part of the trail has been pretty rutted out from rain and just from people dragging brakes. You've got this rock on the inside sticking up. There's a bunch of pedal marks on it, which means other people have really nailed their pedals on that. So what I was talking about, if you have level pedals and you come through here, you're basically gonna clear this rock by whatever that is, 3 inches or so, all good. If you come through here and you panic and you put this pedal all the way down and then try to roll through here, that's gonna be a big crash. You're basically just gonna ram straight into this with your pedal, and then you're gonna be over the bar. So again, I can't stress it enough. If you're a beginner learning to ride, really be disciplined about maintaining level pedals so that you do not have like a pedal strike on a rock and a big crash. So that's that. Okay guys, so there you go. That's basically start to finish sort of my opinion and recommendation on how to use your feet to optimize braking. So again, level pedals and being able to dive your heels as the braking gets harder or the terrain gets steeper. As you can see in a section like this, that becomes pretty important. If you don't have those two things, it's gonna be very hard to progress past a certain level of trails. So I hope you guys found it helpful and learned something, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace. Okay, so one bonus tip that I would recommend when you're learning these techniques is to ride flat pedals if you have them and you're not already. If you're riding clip pedals like I do and a lot of us do, you can definitely develop bad habits pretty easily. And one of those that I noticed for myself is that I won't dive my heels as much when I'm riding clip pedals over time, because basically one of the big advantages of riding clip pedals is that your feet stay on the pedals. So when you're braking through rough stuff like this, your feet aren't bouncing off the front of the pedals. It's easier to keep your feet planted. So, but because you have that kind of to fall back on, at least for me personally, a couple times a year, I like to go back to flat pedals. Allows me to kind of refresh a few techniques. If I'm getting a little lazy on stuff, especially like this, I'll find when I go back to flats and I ride a rough trail like this, my feet are kind of bouncing all over the place. And a lot of it's because I just am not diving my heels as much as I should be. So you might be able to get away with it on clip pedals, but ultimately you're not going to be able to brake as hard as you could if you're using the right technique, diving those heels, all that kind of stuff. So as a bonus tip, I would recommend when you're learning this stuff, for sure, flat pedals. If you're already on clips, I'd recommend maybe going back to flats and kind of training yourself to do this stuff properly before going back to clips. I think ultimately it'll make you better in the long run. So hope that helps. It's funny, dude, when I go back to flats and I come through stuff like this, my feet like are flying all over the place sometimes. Like I have to make like okay, you need to like conscious effort. Like my technique gets a lot better when I ride flats. Sweet.